Walter for that very, very generous introduction, and thank you to all of you for being here today. I particularly want to thank members of my Mathcore family who are here today to support me as I present research that could not have come to fruition without them. And one of the reasons why it's so important to me to come to the Humanities Center and talk is that even people who are not able to come, I know will eventually be able to see this on YouTube and be able to see the research that I've been doing presented in a scholarly fashion. But today I'll definitely be aiming my talk at an audience, at a lay audience, that I'm going to try as much as possible to define any terms that are unusual for that audience. And I also want to thank members of my Language and Societies class who are here today. I had great plans to have us have our first meeting last Tuesday, and I'd tell you all about myself, and then we'd come this week. But as it turns out, I'm meeting some of you for the very first time today, and I appreciate your forbearance for allowing me to reschedule our lives and reschedule our term to let me present this research at what turns out to be the very, very beginning of our journey together in linguistic anthropology. So as Dr. Edwards indicated, I am a linguistic anthropologist, and I study mathematics. And so today what I'm going to be talking about is a particular linguistic aspect of the research that I've been doing at the Mathcore since 2009. But to begin, before I do anything else, I just want to give you a little snippet and a little episode of a conversation I witnessed in the third week of my field study. And this is in a classroom setting with a teacher, 10 teaching assistants, and 20 7th grade students. And so the teacher, all of these are pseudonyms. The teacher asked, why does this make sense, Raheem? And Raheem says, because you have to break it, because you have to make the 8 into an improper fraction. And at this moment, something very strange happens. The TAs in the class, these are high school students, mostly who've been through the Mathcore program for several years, start reacting very oddly. And as an anthropologist, when people start reacting oddly, you're supposed to pay attention and take notes. Huh? What's that? What? What? What the heck is that? And the teacher says with a vague tone of disgust, oh, improper fraction? What's so improper about fractions? And then Raheem corrects or repairs to say, oh, fraction greater than 1. And at this point, the TAs say, oh, all right, oh, I thought they was behaving badly. That sounds kind of familiar. They then carry on with the classroom as if nothing had happened. This is weird. This doesn't happen every day, and it was something that drew my attention to something particularly important that's proven to be the core of my research with the Mathcore over the past several years. Now let me, for those of you who may not know much about the Mathcore, let me tell you a little bit about it. It's an enrichment mathematical community that's been here at Wayne State since 1992, and you can go down to the first floor to the Center for Excellence and Equity in Mathematics any day in this building, and Mathcore people are there. But Mathcore is primarily a summer camp with a Saturday program, and it's an enrichment program that here in Detroit is dedicated to serving public and charter school students from the 7th grade onward here at Wayne State. They come to Wayne State, they learn mathematics, and this is an attempt not just to remediate, but to really allow students to explore a real love of mathematics as part of a very different math curriculum. And it serves around 400 participants per year, which includes both middle school students and high school students from Detroit. And it has a real commitment to curricular excellence in mathematics, but not only to curricular excellence, but also to personal growth and social change. That this is not simply a curricular movement, but that it's a social movement. And one of the things that really distinguishes it from a lot of other college programs, you can go to any college campus anywhere in the country and see math programs run for high school students, but it's that long-term participation is very, very common. And so it's very, very common for students to return through high school and through college and even beyond. So it's many, many students return for 7 years. Some of the longest term participants who started as students have been involved really for almost the whole time, which is almost 20 years now in Mathcore. And that's really different than what you would expect and what you find in lots of other similar programs, or supposedly similar programs. So the framework I'm going to be using to describe Mathcore today, I'm going to start with a term which will be familiar to anthropologists, but may not be familiar outside of that, which is to understand Mathcore as a community of practice. And a community of practice is a social group that shares knowledge and skills in a particular domain of activity. So we all learn things in lots of different environments, and if you're a student at Wayne State, you learn because you go to a class and you learn some subject matter like linguistic anthropology. But that doesn't make a community of practice. What makes a community of practice is that it is a group that is founded around and organized around the principle of sharing knowledge and skills, that it's not just restricted to particular episodes of learning, but that learning occurs formally and informally, and it's organized around some particular domain of activity, in this case mathematics. And it's characterized by this rather cumbersome term, legitimate peripheral participation. This is clunky, but what it really means is that newcomers become members of a group by participating in simple tasks, usually informal tasks, that help them learn the goals, the principles, and the vocabulary of the group. It's not structured, but it's also not random. By participating in a community of practice, you're learning what makes you a member of that group, and over time, you participate fully in that group as well. And so it's essentially a form of socialization. It is extremely important in lots and lots of environments, including this one. In Mathcore, nobody uses the term community of practice, but they do use another term which actually captures the elements that I want to talk about today, and that's the Mathcore way. And so you don't have to go be very long in Mathcore, participate in Mathcore, that you'll hear people talking about the Mathcore way. And this is a local term that's used to refer to a set of mathematical, social, and linguistic practices. Some of them are transmitted formally as part of the curriculum, but a lot of them are transmitted informally. And what's important here is that these are not just any old values, but they are seen as specific to Mathcore, that's why they're the Mathcore way, and that they're explicitly divergent, sometimes even oppositional to those outside the community. So for instance, in mathematical practices, there are algorithms or procedures for solving problems that are explicitly seen to contrast with the school curriculum to which Detroit Public School students would be exposed. In terms of social and moral practices, there's constant discourse at Mathcore about the ways that the moral structure of the program differs from what students are likely to find outside. Could be different from their home environments, certainly different from their school environments in terms of an emphasis on kindness, compassion, integrity, and courage, and a central ideal of greatness. And this is a subject on which I talked last year at this venue, and so I won't go into that in greater detail now. What I want to talk about today is in fact a set of linguistic practices that are common to the Mathcore way, which involve prescriptive linguistic norms and a divergent lexicon. In simpler terms, what that means is there are particular ways of talking, particular words, particularly mathematical words, that are favored or disfavored in Mathcore, and are part of learning to be a member of this community of practice involves learning this terminology and learning to become fluent in it. And one's membership in the community is not defined by whether you use those terms, but it certainly is a central part of the Mathcore way that these terms are approved or other terms are disapproved. And this is what I call prescriptive linguistic norms. So my research question for this paper is as follows. How and why does the Mathcore community of practice use prescriptive language as a socialization practice? So as part of this process of becoming a member of the Mathcore community of practice, one learns these rules and norms for how to talk. How does this work, and why the particular norms that exist? So this is just a bit about my study. My study involved participation of the Site 1 Mathcore, which is principally over at State Hall, and the main period of observation was from 2009 to 2011. Participant observation involves what might look to the outside observer like hanging out. And in fact, that's a lot of it, hanging out with a notepad and a voice recorder, learning about how people do things, asking questions where appropriate. And so those of you who have known me from Mathcore, that's what it looked like I was doing, because that was what I was doing. But in addition, I was conducting a set of interviews, and I conducted 136 semi-structured interviews, which ranged in length from about 20 minutes to about an hour, with 56 individuals, including students and staff. And I then did what's called discourse analysis of linguistic events that occurred in the program. I was looking at what people say, how they say it, what they foreground as being important, and how they rationalize their behavior, how they talk about their behavior. These are the sorts of things that have interested me over the past several years. And while this study is very broad and all-encompassing, I have other material on social organization, on the moral aspects, and on mathematics. Today what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be focusing on the language. Focusing on language as an element of social life. Not to the exclusion of the other stuff, but given that there's limited time, this is my goal for today. All right, so we have this term prescriptivism, and I have it in my title, and I've been talking about prescriptive language. But what is it? What is prescriptivism? Well, prescriptivism essentially consists of cultural norms and standards and beliefs that govern the appropriateness or inappropriateness of particular linguistic forms. You encounter prescriptive language in your lives all the time. So for instance, you may have heard that ain't in the dictionary. Well, this is a norm. This is a value associated with the particular word ain't. It says that this isn't really a real word at all, because when you say something's not in the dictionary, what you really mean is it shouldn't be in the dictionary. I actually tell my students that that's actually the criterion by which I judge a good dictionary is if ain't in the dictionary, then it ain't a good dictionary. But there are lots of other linguistic norms that are enforced to some degree through these rules and standards. And so, for instance, we've all heard of grammar police or grammar policing or grammar grouching. And this is all under that label of prescriptivism. These ideas about what kind of language is appropriate and what kind of language isn't. And the sociolinguist Deborah Cameron has used this term verbal hygiene to describe prescriptivism. The idea is that your language should be pure, your language should be clean, your language should have all of the features that make it good and moral and rational and sensible, and not all those ones that aren't. Now we all know that actually most of the rules of language are actually quite arbitrary. And so in linguistics, prescriptivism has quite a bad name. That prescriptivism is contrasted with what we see ideologically as important is descriptivism, which is the objective analysis of how language is actually spoken. So in other words, descriptivism is supposed to describe what is, and prescriptivism is supposed to tell people what ought to be, or what should be. And so often, prescriptivism is viewed as an undesirable exercise of social power. And indeed, there needs to be authority for prescriptivism to be effective. You need to have some way to make people believe your prescriptions or make people obey your prescriptions. In fact, dictionaries are very prescriptive objects. They seek to tell you what's a word and what's not a word. But in fact, as Cameron has pointed out, it's inevitable that you are going to have some idea of what is valid or what is valuable language. And so she emphasizes that any attempt to eliminate prescriptivism entirely is not only impossible, but is in fact quite misguided. And in fact, there are lots of times when prescriptivism is actually quite useful. So a good example of this is a domain-specific language like aviation English. And aviation English is the form of English that pilots use with air traffic controllers. And there are specific words and forms that you must use in order to successfully take off and land a plane. And there are good reasons for that. Because the stakes are very high, because communication is sometimes choppy, given technology, and the use of a specific set of linguistic forms is absolutely important. And so I want to, at least with this paper, at least make it clear that in saying that Mathcore is using prescriptive language, this is not a negative thing. And in fact, I want to show why, in fact, it's so valuable within this community that Mathcore does things the way they do. So Mathcore has a variety of linguistic prescriptions. And these fall roughly into two categories, which I'll call procedural and lexical. And so basically all of the terms here under the subpoints are words that you're not supposed to say. And that for at least some staff, all of these are important. Certainly the ones at the top, improper fraction, reduce, cancel, and cross, are very, very strongly stigmatized in classroom settings and in fact beyond. Some of these other, these all refer to procedures that are mathematical procedures that are done as part of the arithmetic curriculum. And they should be replaced with terms like fraction greater than 1, simplify, or factoring out a 1. Another set of prescriptions refer to number reading. And these are actually less explicit at Mathcore, but I have abundant evidence that these are really, really common. That you should avoid saying and in words like 101. You should say 101, not 101. That you should avoid saying the word point for a decimal point. That you should always express a number that has a decimal point as the whole number followed by a fraction. So 6.3 is not really right. 6 3/10 is better. And also similarly, fractions should be expressed using the suffix -s, which refers to the denominator instead of using the term over. So instead of saying 5/6, you should say 5/6. Okay, so these are just some examples, and I certainly don't want to insist that all of these are relevant to all members of Mathcore, but all of them are used by many members of Mathcore lots and lots of the time, especially in the classroom. So when I'm talking about mathematical prescriptivism, this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about language norms and beliefs about what's appropriate and what's not that specifically relate to mathematics and numbers. Now, this mathematical prescriptivism is not exclusive to Mathcore. It's not like one day the Mathcore staff decided to make up all of these things. In fact, each one of these prescriptions that we see on the previous slide exist elsewhere in some mathematical curriculum, or have been mentioned by some writers at some point. And so here's an example here from the literature of Pace, who's a mathematical educator, who wants us to avoid calling something an improper fraction because it has a bad connotation, that it seems like there's something wrong with it. And of course, this is exactly the point from my first episode that I showed you right at the beginning of the talk. Mathematical prescriptivism is characterized by what I'm going to call a discourse of rationality. In other words, that there's a belief, it could be implicit, it could be explicit, that verbal hygiene, improved language, will lead to cognitive hygiene, improved thought. That is, that Mathcore is not simply doing these randomly because they think that these are fun to do, but because the assumption here is that by improving the way kids talk about math, you'll also improve the way that kids think about math. Regardless of whether that's true or not, it is why they do it, and it's why they explicitly say they do it. And that makes it an object of some interest and attention. So here's an example of reading numbers like a mathematician. And we have the teacher here. Percent means hundredths. So if I have 37%, what does that equal to as a fraction? What would that be equal to as a fraction? Yes, Bashira. And Bashira replies 37/100, which, as we know, is one of the things you're not supposed to say. And Mr. Jameson says 37 over 100. How can we say this number like a mathematician? You're close. Oh, when I had this number, how would you say this, Malik? Then Malik, another student, says 1/5. Mr. J says 1/5, yeah. Okay, now how do you think we're going to say, and when we had this, when we had, and of course he's pointing to the board at this point, there's a 1/5, and then there's a 7. When we had this, we said 7/20. So what do you think this would be? Bashir gives then the appropriate answer, 3700. Yes, 3700. And so this is a little prescriptive episode, self-contained within the curriculum. It's not planned out. It only occurs because Bashir makes that initial statement, 37 over 100. But once those occur, the prescriptive sort of module, or the prescriptive script, comes into action. Okay, and now here's an example. We have Malik here. This is on, note, this is July 7th, 2011, or on 2011. And Malik here is involved. 4 days later, I had the opportunity to interview Malik. And I asked him this long question about fractions, whether they're numbers, and I asked at the end, well, they might be like, what kind of number is a fraction? And Malik thinks for a moment. He says, like a half, like hundreds, like 31 over, no, 31 hundredths. So what you see here is an instance of repair. That he starts to say 37 over, but just 4 days ago he's had this episode in class, and then he repairs and says 31 hundredths. He was going to say the same number. We know he was talking about hundredths, and then he's talking about 31 over, now he fixes it. And then he goes on to say, yeah, if I had half a number, like half what you eat or half a sandwich. But the important part here is what I've highlighted is that repair, where he's in fact correcting based on what he knows to be the new norm. This is basically the first week of Mathcore. He's been in Mathcore. He's a 7th grade student at this point. He's been in Mathcore for, this is his 5th day in the program. Okay, so where does this come from? Well, partly it comes from the leadership of Mathcore. And here's an extended passage, which I'm not going to read, from one of the founding members of Mathcore. And he was talking to me about what it was that guided him when he was thinking about the Mathcore and the Mathcore curriculum. And he gives what is a very nice anthropological example here. He wants us to engage in a thought experiment, that what would happen if we built a society with Joe Schmo and Mary whatever, and they're making a committee to come up with a language. And the people would come back to you and say, here, and present you with the English language. We would have given an F as a grade, and that would have been kind. We'd be like, are you guys idiots? Are you complete morons? Every single sentence in the English language just about has an atrocity. So in the Mathcore, that's essentially what we did. We looked at math and recognized this is a stinking mess, just like English. It's a mess. It's being taught in ridiculous ways. So it's very explicit here that there's a link between the mathematical prescriptivism that I'm describing for Mathcore and more general prescriptivism in English in general. The idea that ain't in the dictionary, or that words should be spelled the way they're pronounced, or pronounced the way they're spelled, vice versa. And so this idea seems to have come from the inception of the program. But at that point, it's actually taken on a life of its own. And one of the ways I know it is that not all Mathcore participants agree what particular forms of language are to be stigmatized or preferred. So there are lots of teachers who don't really care if you say and in a word like 101. There are others who do. There's not a big list of prescriptions. These are the bad words, and if students say those, you've got to stop them. In fact, this is exactly because it's a community of practice. These norms and rules are learned through long-term participation. And what is learned above all is that it is good and right and normal to talk about the language of mathematics. This is a good thing to do. This is what we do at Mathcore. We have our own language, and it becomes part of this thing, which is called the Mathcore way. Now, if we take just the language, just as language, mathematical prescriptivism at Mathcore resembles ideas of what we know in anthropology and linguistics as linguistic relativity, or the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. That's basically the idea that language influences thought, that the structure of your language has a profound effect on the structure of thought. And we can see that just taken as language, that's what is going on at Mathcore. But I want to point out in the rest of my talk today that this is not the only thing that's going on. This is not just some sort of simplistic idea that if students start talking the right way, everything will be fixed. But in fact, that these are linked to particular ways of doing things, to particular forms of activity, in this case, mathematical forms of activity that form a part of the Mathcore way. I apologize to any of you at this point for any trauma that may be imposed by any review of arithmetic. I'll try to make it brief. So here's another example of a discussion I had with Charlene, who at this point was a 9th grade student. And I was asking her a standard question off my interview. So I'd like you to multiply two fractions together in your head. What is 9/11 times 11/12? 3/4. So this is a 13, 14-year-old student. In 4 seconds, she's got it right. All right, you got that answer pretty fast. That's correct. How did you do that? She smiles at me and she says, oh, I canceled out the 11ths. I sit there and I just say, ah. And then she laughs because she knows we're playing the same game here. And then she says, and then I was left with 9/12. Actually, that's another violation. And then I reduced it. And these are her emphasis on canceled and reduced. And so then I asked, so why are you laughing? And she says, because that's not the Mathcore way. She knows what she's doing. She's consciously choosing to violate the norms. In an interview setting, I know her very, very well by this point. This is our 4th interview, or maybe our 5th. And we're playing a game. But it's a serious game in a way, because Charlene is a student who really is very, very mathematically adept. And she knows that she not only can she get the right answer, she will get it very, very quickly in her head using algorithms that are different than those taught at Mathcore. This would not be true of all students, but it is true of Charlene, and so she's never really internalized these values. She's internalized other aspects of the values, social aspects, but these linguistic aspects have never seemed to her to make much sense. This is part of a discussion we had on violating the Mathcore way. So let me show you what's going on here. So this is the Mathcore way of solving that problem. You take 9/11 times 11/12. Then you put the two numerators on the top and the two numerators on the bottom. And if you were just to cancel out the 11s, you just cross out the top 11, you cross out the bottom 11. But of course, at Mathcore, we don't cross out anything, because cross is one of the prohibitions. And instead what you do is you flip it around. You flip around the bottom, because multiplication is commutative. You can flip it around, and then what you see is you have 9/12 times 11/11. You see that form of 1, and then instead of crossing it out, in fact, what you're taught to do at Mathcore is you draw a big number 1 through the 11/11. That shows you that all you're really doing is multiplying by a form of 1. This gets you to 9/12. Now, at this point, you can kind of divide each one by 3, and you can kind of see that 9/12 is 3/4. A good mathematician will see instantly that 9/12 is 3/4. But at Mathcore, where the presumption is not that students have everything they need to solve these problems right away, the answer is, well, you break 9 into 3 times 3. You break 12 into 3 times 4. And then once again, you have a form of 1. You draw a 1 through it, and you get 3/4. Now, Charlene didn't write anything. This was done in her head. Yep?
Just a quick question. Do they really use a language a form of 1 and not simply 1?
Yeah, they'll say a form of 1. Because the point is that any fraction that has the same numerator and denominator is a form of 1, or is a way to write 1. But these are the same. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But it's a way to highlight to students that these are 1. But if you say a student, well, that's 1, they'll say, well, why is it 1? Well, it's because any fraction that has the same numerator and denominator is a form of 1, other than 0/0. That's beyond the topic of this conversation. Okay, so what's going on here is that Charlene is not just violating linguistic norms, she's violating arithmetical norms. She's violating the algorithms that she's supposed to be using and highlighting in a very playful way that she is resisting these norms. Now, this is not inherently a bad thing, and I don't think anybody at Mathcore, even if they knew who Charlene was, they're just going to, say, well, you should do it this way, this will work, or this is a good way to teach. But this isn't a punitive exercise, but the idea is that learning to do these things will ultimately highlight what's going on mathematically better than simply doing something that does work as long as you understand what's going on already. Let me give you another example. Here's another thing you're not supposed to say. You don't cross-multiply or cross-cancel. Cross-multiplying is a way of comparing two fractions to see which one is bigger. And many of us have learned this technique that you multiply the numerator of one times the denominator of the other, and you do it the other way, and then you get two numbers. 4 times 9 is 36, 7 times 5 is 35. Actually, that's the point where students sometimes get confused because they're like, well, now what do I do with my 36 and 35? What does it mean? And so what the Mathcore way emphasizes that, well, actually what you're doing here, when you're doing this, is you're multiplying 4/7 by a form of 1. You're multiplying it by 9/9, and you're multiplying 5/9 by another form of 1, 7/7. And what you get in each case is a common denominator. The common denominator in this case is 63. Which is bigger, 36 63rds or 35 63rds? That's obvious. And so the use of this other form, which is they call anti-simplifying, is meant to emphasize that this is actually showing you why it works. Not that cross-multiplying won't work, although I've seen a lot of people get screwed up, but that anti-simplifying helps to elucidate why it works. It helps to encourage that cognitive improvement that Mathcore desires. So the language, once again, is linked to the algorithm. Now I'd like to talk about something a little bit different, though, because some of these other things, like improper fraction, aren't directly linked to any particular algorithm. You can say improper fraction, or you can say fraction greater than 1, but this doesn't inherently involve a different way of working with it. And so I'm going to go back to this first example that we started with, just briefly for a review, where remember, Raheem starts out answering a question and sort of spontaneously says that something is an improper fraction. And then this causes this commotion, where the TAs, who normally would stay quite quiet in a classroom, start interjecting, start being critical, and the teacher then makes this expression of disgust. Then there's an instance of repair, and then things get back to normal. Things are order is restored, the TAs settle down, and this is an example of what I'm going to call a prescriptive melodrama. And this is a classroom episode or a classroom discussion, and it's full of melodramatic or emotional expression regarding a stigmatized word or phrase. And it doesn't just involve the teacher, and it doesn't just involve the student, it involves the whole class. It involves students, teaching assistants, and instructors in a mutually understood frame. And for those of you who have a background in linguistics or anthropology, you'll know here I'm referring to the work of Erving Goffman. And Goffman is talking about frames, and these are ways of highlighting what the norms of a conversation or an event are meant to be. It's a way of saying, what kind of thing are we doing? What kind of event is this? And what kinds of behavior are appropriate during this event? And it often happens when things are different. Things are different than one would expect. And so what it's doing is it's orienting participants to the linguistic norms of the Mathcore way, while also avoiding personal criticism of the students themselves. So this is how they work. A student says a stigmatized word. Rarely, the instructor will broach the subject themselves to introduce the students to a new prohibition. But once they do that, in the future, what happens is the student says a word like improper fraction. What happens then is the teaching assistants, sometimes the other students, will react with negative affect. They'll grimace, they'll scowl, they'll say, "Oh, no, what's that?" They'll sort of shout out in the middle of class. And this is what's called the keying of the frame. It's to point out that something different is going on. And students very rapidly learn that something different is going on. And then the instructor engages in some sort of overdramatic, playful expression of disgust. It's not a literal, it's clearly understood as melodrama, as play, as acting. But for instance, the teacher, Mrs. Davis, might go, "Oh." Another teacher might, feign a heart attack, as if the word has caused him physical pain, has caused him injury. And, or like a false anger, like, "Oh, no, no." And so then this happens, and then there is usually some sort of discussion of the semantics of the word, like what's so improper about fractions, pointing out that, well, there's something about this word that's weird. And sometimes it's long, but sometimes it's short. I have examples where people talk about cross or cancel, and they say, "Oh, we don't go around canceling things. We don't cancel people out of our lives and cross people out of our lives. Those are we don't do those sorts of things." And then at this point, there's usually some sort of discourse of rationality. In the case here, it didn't actually happen because Raheem knows what to say. The students know what's appropriate and they fix it. But if you need it, then what happens is the teacher will say, "Well, here's what we do and here's what we say and here's kind of the reason." It's usually pretty short. Sometimes it's even absent. But it's like some sort of attempt is sometimes made to give some sort of rationale. Quite often, the word or the phrase is then redefined as a word you shouldn't say by making it taboo, by essentially making it a form of profanity. So cancel is the C word, and reduce is the R word. We don't say that word. It's a bad word. But the key here is that it's not directed at the student. It's not that the disgust is directed at the student. The disgust or the anger or the drama is directed at the word. The word becomes personified in this frame. And the word becomes the target of scorn. And then finally, order is restored. The original offender, quote unquote, or somebody else in the class will offer up the preferred term, and then the curriculum will continue as normal. Now, these don't actually, I have 15 of these in my data set. I know of many, many more through my interviews that have been reported to me. But you can actually find these outside of Mathcore entirely. Here's a prescriptive melodrama that occurred on Twitter one fall, that is several weeks after the end of summer camp, between 3 senior staff members. So this is the entire conversation on Twitter. The tweets, and they're tweeting each other and retweeting and so on, between Erica, Philip, and Janine, who are all senior staff, college instructors at Mathcore. Erica says, "Lol, shut up please, you can't be bad and a hood rat." The hood rat cancels out everything. This is spontaneous. Then Philip interjects to say, "We don't say cancel." Then "Lol, yes we can, just not in math." Erica comes back, "Lol, I knew someone from MC who was going to say something." Then Philip gets quite insistent, "Lol, no canceling ever, and I am independent." So the assumption is he's not asserting this on basis of Mathcore. He's doing this on his own. "No, you're not, lol." And then Erica comes back, "Cancel, cancel, 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 cancel." And then Erica wonders, "Did Philip see my cancel tweet?" And then Philip responds, "Canceling a certain someone's employment with a certain place." and then Erica closes us off by saying, "I remember when I didn't talk to my kids for a whole day because they kept saying cross cancel. I was so mad, lol." So here's the important thing to note. The repetition of lol and laughing out loud again and again and again is absolutely necessary for a prescriptive melodrama to occur in a Twitter setting, because otherwise there's a risk that people would take this seriously. And everybody's laughing, everybody's playing this game, they all know the game, and in fact, in the classroom setting, they'll be very upset in this melodramatic way, but they will enforce these prescriptions. What they're doing is they're playing out this cultural event, this part of Mathcore, in a completely different medium. why? Why do we do this at Mathcores? And the reality is that prescriptive melodrama highlights the social and linguistic norms without attacking the students. And prescriptivism is not always nice. Prescriptivism can be directed directly at a student's intelligence in a classroom setting. If you are, casting aspersions on their intelligence based on the words they say, that's a problem. So the prescriptive melodrama solves that problem. It puts language into this different frame, a playful frame, that teaches, that socializes within the community of practice, but no student is going to ever feel degraded or humiliated because the word, not the speaker, is the target. It's worth noting that, as the linguist and anthropologist Keith Basso noted, humor always carries danger. That even when it's playful, when it's directed at people, there's always a risk that things will go wrong if something's misunderstood. I've seen this to a little bit a couple of times. I've seen this in Mathcores. Sometimes students come into the program not in the 7th grade, but they come in the 8th or the 9th grade, where everyone else in their class has been in Mathcore a while. And sometimes when this thing first happens, that student, all the other students already know the rules of the game. They've already been socialized. And sometimes that 8th or 9th grade student will say, what's going on? Why are these bad words to say? They don't get it because they haven't had that long socialization practice. But that's exactly what you would expect of a community of practice where the assumption is that you learn things slowly, you learn them informally, they're not part of the standard curriculum, there's not an instruction on day 3, we're going to tell people not to say cancel. And so it's entirely possible that, the teacher isn't actually aware that, yes, some of these students don't actually know this norm. One of the things that prescription does in this context is it highlights the opposition of and the superiority of the Mathcore way to other norms, to linguistic norms that one would learn in the school setting. And in doing that, it reinforces social ties among community members through this common linguistic usage. Now, very briefly, I'm going to talk about prescription as anti-language. Now, anti-language is another concept developed by the linguist M.A.K. Halliday, which is an elaborate vocabulary used to highlight social distinctions. And learning an anti-language is part of socializing individuals into a group. So for instance, being in the military, you learn a particular language, you learn a particular way of talking, and this becomes part of your socialization. And establishing your full membership in the group. And in Mathcore, this is quite the same, that the linguistic oppositions index or point to social oppositions. And at Mathcore, the opposition is with the traditional school system, because many of the students coming into Mathcore have a very negative attitude towards schooling and towards what they've had so far, some of which is quite mediocre, or worse, to non-existent. And so by creating this opposition, it's actually aiming to produce a positive attitude towards education and towards mathematical education by saying, here is a community, you are part of our community, here are the norms which we will share with you in a playful way, and learning them, by the way, you'll also learn better ways to do math, and you'll improve your cognitive outcomes. They don't say it quite so explicitly, because nothing cultural works if it's quite so explicit. But it's very powerful nonetheless. You absolutely see it going on in the community. And so here's an example. This is an interview I did with Gary, who was a long-term member and a college instructor when I interviewed him. And I asked him, what's cross-multiplying? And he looks at me and he says, I don't know what the hell that is. Then he asked, is that appropriate language for this? Because I'm interviewing him and the voice recorder is on. We laugh, and then I diffuse the situation by saying, hell yeah. And then of course, he shows that he does know the answer. He says, what is cross-multiplying? It's actually a way of getting a common denominator without actually doing all of that. That's what it is. He obviously knows what it is, which is exactly what it is. All right. And then when I ask him, so when you said I don't know what the hell that is, why'd you say that? And he says, because we don't use that language here. And then I say, hell? And then he laughs. He's like, all right. and then we're so which is true, of course, that the teachers and college instructors don't swear at their students either, but they also don't use these C words like cross multiply. And then of course I ask him, well, okay, do you ever cross multiply? He's like, oh, of course, I do it all the time. Do it all the time. But not in class? But not in class, right. So this is clearly establishing there's a linguistic opposition and that he knows why he's doing it because we don't use that language here. But outside, he's aware of why cross-multiplying works, and he does it all the time. The last thing I want to talk about very briefly is another form of prescription that doesn't occur at Mathcore, and that is prescription against African American English. So, as we know from the work of linguistic anthropologists and sociolinguists, there's a lot of prescription in school settings against the forms of English that are characterized of the African American English dialect. And so here's an episode that doesn't involve any of the forbidden words. Mr. Jameson and Peter are both African American. Mr. Jameson is the teacher, of course. Mr. Jameson said, let's count everybody. We're going to start at 90. Peter corrects, he wants to fix something that he said previously. He's like, oh, I mean 3,100,000. And Mr. Jameson says, 3,100,000. I love it. You must be from the east side. You from the east side? That's what I'm talking about. So immediately he is recognizing a common identity, obviously associating with the majority African American east side of Detroit. And everybody laughs because everybody's in on the joke. 3,100,000, 3,100,000. So immediately then he engages in the repair. Very good, Peter. Very good comeback. Very good. 3,100,000. All right, we're moving along. And then he goes on to say beautiful things and talk about good things in the world. There's no prescription here. He uses both forms because, of course, not every person at Mathcore is a speaker of African American English. They're not all from the east side. And so saying 3,100,000, 3,100,000 includes everybody. But nobody much cares if you say 3,100,000. In fact, here's a little, African American students are, I'm actually going to skip that one. Here's a thing I took on the chalkboard of the staff room, and I know the person who wrote this, who is African American, $650. And the thing about Mathcore is that if someone asks, what's 13 times 50? Nobody much cares if you say 650. But they do care if you say 650. That's the prescription that's relevant. Not the prescription that's relevant to African Americans, but a prescription that's relevant to Mathcore. All right. In conclusion, mathematical prescriptivism at Mathcore serves several functions. The first is, it's part of a discourse of rationality. It's linguistic. It highlights a presumed direct linkage between good language and improved mathematical cognition. Secondly, it focuses attention on a set of locally preferred algorithms and notations. It's not just language, but language plus activity, mathematical activity. Third, that it builds student identification with the locally preferred lexicon in opposition to ordinary school math. That it really teaches them that they're learning something important here, and it's local and it's yours. It's yours, this is the Mathcore way, and you are part of the Mathcore family. This is powerful, and you can use it. And in doing so, finally, it promotes social solidarity within this enduring community of practice. That it's not just one day, 1 week, 1 year. But this is now, in fact, a multi-generational community of practice that is not only a mathematical community, but also a social and a moral one. Thank you very much. I want to thank the staff and students of Mathcore, without whom my work could not have occurred. I want to thank my research assistant, Monica Rodriguez, for her help and her research assistance in 2010 and 2011. And I want to thank the Merrill Palmer Skillman Institute and Wayne State University's Office for the Vice President of Research for funding this research. Thank you very much. Do we have time for 1 or 2 questions?
Yes, so we must.
Yeah, Bob.
Okay,
most of what you said made sense. The one that concerned me, how would they say then if they were discussing pi and what is the value of pi to 10 decimal points?
Yeah, and this is actually a really interesting case because sometimes you'll have, and I had a long section, I had to cut this down quite a bit. I have a long section in the paper on which this is based on what happens, because sometimes there are ambiguities that result, and sometimes there are things that are cognitively complex, because you're right, that 3 and 142 million, you can't even do it because pi is irrational. But if you have 10 decimal places, you could say pi and some number of 10 billions, but nobody says that. And in fact, what they say is 3.141592654389, would go on. Dean Raskin can do it to 1,000 digits. I've only got 10 or 12. And this isn't a competition. But you're right, that does cause a problem. There are also problems if I were to say, like, what's this number?
We can't see it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, sorry. I'll do this one. I'll do this one. What's this number?
427,000.
427,000. Okay, and what's this number?
487,000.
But the first one you don't say and, 427,000.
Right.
The second one, 400 and.
So in fact, one of the rationales for not saying and is that in doing that, it distinguishes 427,000 from 427,000. So these are not out of nowhere. And that's the importance, is understanding that all of this reading numbers stuff doesn't just occur randomly, that it occurs in a system. Now, it's not a perfect system, and in fact, there are all kinds of weird violations. So for instance, fractions that are over 101, then you end up with these weird fractions that are like 6 101sts, and 101sts sounds odd. So most, not only students, but staff will say 6 over 101 in this case. And in fact, they'll even say 6 over 101, because those Dalmatians have ruined us all. So there are lots of exceptions, but the point is in the discourse that this is what's normative. This actually causes some problems because the students try very hard to do what they're taught, and sometimes the teacher will kind of have to massage this a bit and finesse it. It becomes very complex discursively. Yeah, Kevin.
I have a question. The new instructors and new TAs, how do they learn these, what not to do? Is it codified in some way, or is it just? But also in the corporate, do you find the instructors or TAs oopsing on?
Oh, sure. Every human being oopses all the time.
Students catching them on it?
Yeah, sometimes, but sometimes then, students don't normally call out their teachers too explicitly, yeah, it does happen. As to the question of socialization for new staff, it's actually a really interesting question. Of course, a lot of new staff are longtime participants. You come through all the way, but there are always new people who have no prior exposure to Mathcore. And mostly what they report to me, there's not some, they don't sit you down in your training and give you a list of bad words, but there is definitely a sense in which it's understood that this is an important part of what's learned, and they learn it very rapidly. In training, informally, mostly, from other TAs and college instructors and senior staff, rather than as part of the formal curriculum. But there is also some resistance on the part of some of the staff who don't feel that this is particularly important. And I think actually the reason for that is, if you just look at it at the linguistic level, if you just look at it as linguistic practice, then yeah, it's really unlikely that there are lots of kids out there who can't work with improper fractions, that is fractions where the numerator is greater than the denominator, because they're using the word improper fraction. That takes Sapir-Whorf to this wild extreme. On the other hand, once you link in this other stuff, once you link in the social explanations and the procedural explanations, these prescriptions actually all make sense. They make sense as part of a social practice and a socialization, and as part of a general idea that mathematical language is something we prescribe, is something we have the Mathcore way. And anything is then open to play. And so I actually think that some of these have emerged, not from the top down, but have emerged sort of organically. But I wouldn't be able to say because I came into this program when it had already existed for 17 years. Leah.
Yeah, it definitely seems to me not that language is influencing cognition, but in most of these cases, cognition is influencing language. So it's like, the reason why we don't say improper fractions is because we're doing it this different way, which means that the improper fraction, it seems like that seems to be more relevant.
Yeah. Although improper fraction is one where there really isn't any, there is no algorithm associated with it. Improper fraction, you know, you work with an improper fraction the same as you work with a fraction greater than 1. The only prescription there is the same one that I showed in the literature. It sounds wrong. It sounds like it's bad. It sounds like it shouldn't be right. And that's all there is to it. So there's no cognition on that one. It is, though, part of this broader socialization, and the idea that it is normal and right and natural for the language of mathematics to make sense. And then, well, that doesn't make sense because there's nothing wrong with it. So let's give it another name that does make sense. Let's just describe what it is, which is, of course, exactly what it is.
Is there an analogous prohibition of negative numbers?
Is there an analogous prohibition of negative numbers? No, negative numbers are still all right. There is a little bit of a prescription, although not a strong one. I've been playing around with the data, and I wouldn't be willing to put that the preference is for the form negative rather than minus. So that's so that you make it clear that minus is what you say is the operation of subtraction, and 6 minus 4 equals 2. 6 minus negative 4 equals 10. And that's to distinguish those two things. I haven't heard that explicitly said, and it's not so overwhelming that I would be willing to, but that is exactly how I think that some of these prescriptions come into being, is that people kind of get attached to them, and then over time they become part of the community of practice. They're not formalized. Okay, I'll take Leah, she was first.
Okay, so I guess to be more clear, what I meant was that it seems like these prescriptivisms exist more to make people, like, to do these differentiating things against, like, what they do in their school and what they do here, and the
Yes.
ones that aren't just have to do with because we think of them differently. So it doesn't seem like, to me, there's a big link between language influencing cognition, other than the fact that now I feel like I'm a part of your group.
Right, and that's exactly right. And I've actually, a couple of senior staff have actually told me as much. Oh, the reason we do this, the reason I pretend to have a heart attack is not because, I think that there's this is a magic bullet, but it's part of this socialization. Then the students become invested in it. And it really, that socialization is absolutely critical. But it's absolutely critical in any community of practice. That's the basis of the theory. Kevin?
Just on talk of minus, I was wondering if the and prohibition goes for addition to, like 36 and 72 is.
Yeah, and
one way.
I've never heard that, but I could probably run some data. Unfortunately, trying to mark up a corpus for the word "and" is a disaster.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Mike.
I was going to ask if the concept of irrational numbers is discussed linguistically at all.
Yes and no. I mean, irrational numbers are called irrational numbers. They're not prohibited on that basis. There's not a new name for them. But there is some discussion of, these numbers, they're crazy. They're so crazy because they just keep on going forever and ever. And it's it's not really a prescriptive melodrama because there's no prescription associated with it, but it is this highly melodramatic, playful episode that would occur. All right, thank you very much, everybody.